This is Gail Morgan welcoming you to the Libertarian Counterpoint. Now, your host, James Just.
And thank you for joining me today. With me is Mr. Friend of the Show, John Cameron. Mr. Friend of the Show, John Cameron. That's some days my mind doesn't work properly. And the venerable Mr. Richard Fields. Gentlemen.
Venerable.
Venerable Mr. Richard Fields. Yes.
Does that mean old?
No.
No, okay.
No. Governor Newsom has been running around the country on his goofy not running for president thing. And he's given a couple interviews, one with, he went on Fox News and talked about, the difficulties California was having. And then he went to the New York Times and essentially admitted California is a failing state. So if governor is now admitting that California is a failed state or a failing state, which those of us who live here kind of understand that, we've got 4 in 10 residents, 4 in 10 California residents are thinking of leaving. How is Governor Newsom? I want to know, how is Governor Newsom running around patting himself on the back for the work he's done in California when we're just falling apart? I don't understand just this whole notion that he's doing. I don't understand this whole thing. It's like, is he failing upwards? Is that what the Democrats are doing? Is really that's what we're going to?
I think we're watching the Peter Principle in operation.
John?
That's one theory. Yeah. Well, I think the people like in general some of the things that the state represents. They like the wealth. They like all the activity that they can do. They like if they're members of minority groups in general, like the fact that they're accepted here. But I don't know what they can compare that to. If they've gone to another state, they might feel more accepted. What they don't like is the fallout from 50 years of Democratic Party rule, that they don't. There's a disconnect between economic policies that are creating the problems and the fact that they like all the other things that are way too costly because of bad economics. So it's a weird kind of contagion. People don't see the policies that they think make them feel good about the inclusiveness and protection of minority rights and blah 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 blah. I hate to say blah, 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 and I just did it, as part and parcel and effect of the economic policies that are crushing the state and the environmental policies that are making it impossibly expensive to live here. So it's weird, people rail against the effects of the things that also things they like. And, as Thomas Sowell so eloquently put it, there are no solutions, only trade-offs.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing what we're seeing in California as well as New York and a few other states is we're seeing an out-migration of the talented and hardworking and an in-migration, or at least staying put, of those who benefit from the largesse of mama government. And that's something that becomes much more unsustainable as more and more productive people leave the state, which of course is exactly what's happening. We have productive people as well as productive businesses saying, you know what, I think I can make more money and have a better life in Florida or Texas or elsewhere. And once the productivity, once the money leaves, once there's less money available for government to divvy up, to basically steal and give to their friends or their voters, it's a downward spiral. California has entered that downward spiral. New York has as well. And if Gavin Newsom thinks that he can do that for the country as a whole, he will not have a successful presidency, even if he is lucky enough to get elected.
And if the economics don't work, right? If we've made it so it's so insanely expensive to live and work in California, then the supposed inclusiveness and all that is meaningless, right? Because the people the very people you're trying to uplift can't uplift themselves because you've created the economic conditions where they can't, and so now they're dependent upon the government, which is always going to fail in the long run, right? If you as an individual become dependent on the government, from a society, one or two people may find a way to navigate it, but out of 100, it's not going to do it, right? You're going to fail far more people than you're going to succeed, and then you're going to help. And we're creating a class of victims here in California. Everybody's a victim, and if you're not a victim of whatever the cause du jour of the day is, right? You're a victim of the government trying to fix that problem. And so I don't know. It just seems like California is on its death spiral, and I don't know how we're going to get out of it.
Yeah, and there's a lesson in this for conservatives as well. Conservatives are very fond of pointing out that California is an economically failing state, but what they fail to recognize is that when people migrate from California to Florida or Texas, they are voting with their feet they're essentially voting against the California government and in favor of the Florida or Texas government. And that's a good thing because it causes competition between governments to provide the best environment for all of their citizens, not just those citizens who consider themselves to be victims. But what conservatives fail to recognize is the same thing works internationally. There was a time when the United States was a country where immigration was essentially open. Anybody who wanted to come here could come here and did by the hundreds of thousands. And that drove the economic success of this country in the early part of the 20th century and the 19th century. As soon as those gates went down, and Cato has done a study now which says that if you want to immigrate legally to the United States, you have a 1% chance of succeeding. In other words, 99% of the people who want to move to the U.S. can't do it because the regulations and the red tape and the falderall getting to citizen status are essentially impossible to navigate. The fact that we're barring the best and the brightest from other countries from coming to the U.S. will work to the downfall of the U.S. in the long run. And at the same time, we're starting to see an out-migration of talented people from the U.S. to Latin America and elsewhere.
It's actually even worse than that 1% when you look at it, because that includes people who have relatives here who are on a much easier path. You know, if you have a son, then as a father and mother, you can get here. If you have a father, then as a son, you can get here, and so on. If you remove that from it, I think that 1% would be more like 1/3%, or maybe even 1/10%, because that includes that group. I think I could be wrong about that. So it's tough, and you know they're in the migration of talented people all day long, but we don't have time. So
yeah. Well, I want to point out for California, if you look at the states that have activists, have become run by activists, be it California, Illinois, New York, Washington, Oregon, activists don't know how to run things. They just don't. Their perspective is too narrow to have a representative perspective, and what you need in government is a representative perspective. And when you have a bunch of activists running government, you end up with an activist government, and things fall apart because activists can't run things. So, you know, I'm going to end it with that. Richard, you had some perspective on Daniel Ellsberg passed away a couple of weeks ago, and Richard has a perspective he wants to share with us.
Yeah, that was 52 years ago, and John and I are Vietnam era. You're not, James, but in 1971, Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers. And those of you who are not of Vietnam era, perhaps a little history lesson is necessary. The Pentagon Papers' significance is that it was a history of the Vietnam War prepared by the Pentagon. And this history documented the trajectory of the Vietnam War up until 1971. And it explicitly stated that the country's leaders, both Democratic and Republican, both under Lyndon Johnson and Kennedy before him, and under Richard Nixon, knew the war was a lost cause, but they continued it anyway. And they repeatedly lied to the public that victory was imminent. John, you'll remember there's daylight at the end of the tunnel was very often repeated in the on CBS or ABC News. Those lies were obediently parroted by the legacy media, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the three major TV radio networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS. And the media repeated, or the lie was perpetuated because of pressure from the military-industrial spook complex, because they were the ones that profited from increased warfare spending. They operated under the ideological smokescreen that they were stopping the advent of communism. It was the so-called domino theory. Domino theory was that Vietnam falls, Laos is next, then Malaysia, and eventually Australia, and then who knows, maybe the United States. You got to stop communism in its tracks, and the tracks are right now in Vietnam. That was the theory. But something happened in 1969. The war changed from one led by Democrat President LBJ to one led by the Republican newly elected President Nixon. And it was much less popular. It was always unpopular among the anti-war activists. Who can forget of that era? Who can forget, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? But that was the war protesters. After Nixon became president, everybody essentially became a war protester because it was no longer a Democratic-led war. Did that influence the Times and later the Washington Post's decision to fight for free press, for the free press right to publish the top secret documents Ellsberg provided to them? I'm not sure about that, but it's very instructive to read two parallel obituaries of Ellsberg. One by Glenn Greenwald, published in the Rolling Stone, and the other published in the New York Times. The Times chronicles the history of Ellsberg giving the documents to New York Times correspondent Neil Sheehan, with instructions to Sheehan to take notes but not photocopy the documents. Sheehan broke that agreement. He photocopied the papers, and the New York Times published them. The Times obituary chronicles how Ellsberg narrowly escaped prison on espionage charges brought by the Nixon administration. And this is the 1917 Espionage Act brought into place by President Wilson during World War I, which basically says it's real easy to get prosecuted for espionage. If they don't like you, they'll figure out a reason. Anyway, Sheehan broke the agreement, broke the agreement, photocopied the papers, published them, and the judge ultimately threw out the espionage charges against Ellsberg because the Nixon administration went a little too far. Do you remember the White House plumbers, later of Watergate fame? Well, the plumbers originally burglarized Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. They were looking for dirt on Ellsberg so they could smear him during the trial. That's where the Times description of Ellsberg activism ends. Ultimately, the judge threw out the case because of that action by the White House to burglarize his psychiatrist's office. In contrast, Greenwald's story tells of how he and Ellsberg went on after Vietnam to found the Freedom of the Press Foundation. The purpose of that foundation was expressly to serve as a conduit to circumvent the federal government coerced ban on MasterCard, Visa, and other financial intermediaries, which had been serving as a conduit for financial support for WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. WikiLeaks, of course, was telling the truth, the dirt, essentially the Pentagon Papers of the 80s on the Iraq War. The foundation went on to provide support to Edward Snowden, to Chelsea Manning, Tom Drake, William Binney, and many others. Ellsberg was highly critical of the Obama administration, demonizing of Snowden and Manning. Not a word of that in the Times obituary, but a full accounting by Greenwald. Greenwald further relates how in 2021, just 2 years ago, Ellsberg, who vehemently opposed the U.S. involvement in the proxy war in Ukraine, Ellsberg released a top secret document. It was an old one dating back to 1958, but still marked top secret, showing that the U.S. had plans for using a first strike nuclear attack on China after China had seized some islands off of Taiwan, again, back in 1958. Ellsberg was explicitly daring the federal government to bring the same espionage charges under the 1917 Act against him as had been threatened by both the Trump and the Biden administrations against Snowden and Assange. His larger purpose was to highlight the extreme dangers of the escalating proxy war between two nuclear powers, Russia and the U.S., taking place in Ukraine. Is the New York Times interested in defending freedom of the press, which they did with the Pentagon Papers, or are they only interested when it advances their own preferred political narrative? I challenge you to read the Greenwald obit in Rolling Stone or the New York Times obit. Compare and contrast and answer that question for yourself. Once you've answered that, ask yourself if we have any chance of hearing anything close to the objective truth from most members of the mainstream media, most of whom take their cues from the New York Times.
Oh, thank you, Richard. So that's it. Daniel Ellsberg is an interesting case, right? It's an interesting. Maybe you want to step out and step back in, John. Maybe that's a solution.
And no, Ellsberg was the bona fide anti-war person. He was trained as a Marine. He spent a year in Vietnam working. I think it was for a think tank. So he knew what was happening on the ground in Vietnam, and he worked for the RAND Corporation, which is a big military-industrial think tank. And he was moved to release the papers when he found out that, or when a Vietnam veteran is basically broke down in a public meeting, and his only regret related to Greenwald and I'm sure others was that he had not released the Pentagon Papers much earlier than he did, thereby saving hundreds of thousands of lives that needlessly were lost in Vietnam.
Yeah, and the difference between how the media is treating Ellsberg and how they treat, how they've been treating
Snowden
and all the others is
Snowden, Assange, Manning. Yeah.
Yeah, that's how the media is. We know the government's going to treat them the way the government's going to treat them. It's how the media has been treating them, and it is disappointing, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, it's the government narrative, which is a Democratic government narrative now, is that whatever the government says, we'll repeat verbatim. We're the mouthpiece of the media.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And that was not the case. When the Pentagon Papers were published.
Man, did you have a thought on Ellsberg before he moved on?
What's that?
Did you have a thought on Ellsberg before he moved on?
Yeah, the Rolling Stone piece is much more true to form. He was a champion of freedom of the press, and even though he was philosophically, I think you'd call him a liberal, he was as the ACL. He didn't care, which side it was. Everyone had the right to, have a bully pulpit, and if the government, no matter who was in charge, was doing something wrong, the people had a right to know, and I absolutely agree with that. Yeah.
Well, an interesting segue is Michigan Democrats are passing a law that makes free speech essentially illegal if you offend somebody. Well, they can punish you for years in jail and $5,000 of fine if you offend somebody. Well, if you offend a particular set of people that they at the moment find, unoffendable, there's a real attack on the freedom of us to speak our mind, to freely speak our mind, and it's all coming from, at the moment anyway, one side of the aisle. It will come from the other side of the aisle at a different time, but at the moment, it's all coming from the Democrat Party.
Hate speech is, simplified hate speech is whenever you say something I disagree with, I will brand it hate speech and I will throw you in prison. That's kind of the what's going on here. And it's not something, as you pointed out, it's not something that just Democrats do. In a different time and place, Republicans will jump on the opportunity. Give Kamala congressman from Missouri or a senator from Missouri. He'll do the same thing if he gets the opportunity. In fact, he's trying to tear down the internet right now. He's colluding with Democrats to get rid of the section 230 or whatever it is that provides internet freedom of speech on the internet.
Yeah, it's. I find it depressing that so many people who used to, not even all that long ago, promote free speech, promote the freedom of the press, and promote, that fact that we are able to speak our minds freely, are now essentially attacking it because, well, we don't want to hear what you have to say. We don't want to have your, we don't want to hear your offensive speech. So we're just going to plug our ears and, the monkey see no evil, hear no evil thing, right?
Well, it's sort of like hate crimes, hate speech, hate crimes. A crime is a crime. If you kill somebody, your motive, it doesn't make any difference to the life or death of your victim. He's dead anyway. He's dead anyway. So adding an enhancement because of perceived hate on the part of the killer is kind of pointless. It's, make the crime and make speech. And remember,
I'm going to throw out my
the antidote
ridiculous
to hate. The antidote
view on hate crimes
is for speech.
Go for it, Joe.
If people should be punished more because the motivation of their crime was hate, especially hatred of a certain religion or race, like anti-Semitic or anti-black or anti-white, then if their crime is committed through a feeling of love, should they have lesser punishment? So it's ridiculous, as Richard said. A crime is a crime is a crime. We have motivation. It shouldn't have anything to do with the severity of the crime. I mean, if it's planned murder, then it's murder in the first degree. If it's murder through anger, it's murder in the second. But the idea that you should carry a greater penalty because you hate a particular protected subclass of the population is ludicrous. Murder is murder, arson is arson.
A crime is a crime, and the minute you start dissecting the crimes into, well, it's more of a crime if you did it against this person, it's less of a crime if you did it against that person, that becomes very strange very quickly. And I think it's one of those things we should probably avoid that kind of thing as much as possible. Economic freedom has been declining in the United States. According to the Heritage Foundation, we once ranked number 4 in the world in economic freedom, and we're now 25th. It's not surprising, when we live in places like California where you can't walk anywhere without tripping over some economic regulation. But it's distressing, right? We used to be the standard bearer, and now we're average at best in terms of economic freedom, right?
Yeah, it's not a perfect correlation, but I think there is a correlation between economic freedom and other civil liberties, other freedom of the press, freedom of speech, etc. Again, it's not perfect. Singapore has very strong economic freedom, but they're not so very good on freedom of speech and so forth. But Switzerland, for example, ranks right up there at the top. Is pretty good on civil liberties and one of the top 4 in freedom of economics. So I think that once we neglect freedom of economics, freedom to make a living, freedom, right to own property, those sorts of things, once we leave those behind, then we're more apt to leave other freedoms behind. And I think property rights is very instructive in that regard. If I own property, if I have some material wealth, I can afford a bigger soapbox. If I don't own anything, I can't afford anything other than the proverbial soapbox and a megaphone yelling from the street corner. Mm-hmm. But if I have a little bit more wealth, I can buy a paid ad in a newspaper or on TV, or I can support a foundation or a nonprofit media outlet that I agree with. So there's a definite correlation between economic freedom and the rest of our freedoms.
Yep. John, we're going to go to one that's out of your heart here. School closures, the COVID school closures rapidly accelerated U.S. learning loss. And considering that the U.S. schools were terrible to begin with, they didn't have anywhere to go, right? So this is actually more disastrous than we can actually imagine. Am I wrong?
Yes, and no, you're not wrong. The school closures, we did it here. The rest of the world didn't do it. Basically, the states that did it. I'd love to see a state by state analysis of learning loss. You could certainly look at, rich folks' kids did better off than poor folks' kids during the lockdown, but then they do. I don't know whether, I guess you can hear me. What's telling is that even in the UK they did some distancing and they tested people, but what was really hurtful, and nobody's really talked about it a lot except for special ed teachers, people who deal with students who have learning disabilities. There's a psychologist from UCLA in the 80s came up with a rule about the power of communications, and 57% of it, I think, is through body language, and 30 some odd percent is through tone of voice, and only 8% through words. So if you put people in an environment where they can't see faces, especially young children, they can't perceive the reaction what they're saying is having, they can't react to people in a way that gives them either positive or negative reinforcement. No matter what the tech is, your ability to communicate, to send a message and receive one is going to be worse. And it's unconscionable to me that people didn't just scream in anger and not let this happen, because we discovered very, very soon in this whole process that children were virtually immune to COVID. And when they got sick, they didn't get very sick, and most of the time they didn't get sick. And then the teachers' unions convinced the world that children were super spreaders to protect the teachers. Teachers' job to teach. I mean, isn't it their job? Have them show up in hazmat suits if they have to, if they're that worried. Teach.
One of the things that I've been puzzled by and would be really interested in seeing some research on, some of the kids that did not go to public schools, and that's what we're talking about for the most part here, are government schools. Some of the kids were homeschooled or homeschooled, de facto homeschooled. And some kids were just left free to do whatever. I'd be really interested in seeing how well the homeschooled kids did compared
I'd love to see the same thing.
Compared to people that did remain in public school, and also compared to people who received no schooling whatsoever. I think that would be instructive.
Yeah, well, of course, we're never going to get that data because they don't want to give it. We never get the data directly that compares private schools and homeschooling to public schools, because you don't want, the public schools will never survive that kind of scrutiny, and we will never survive being out of time. So thank you, gentlemen, for being here. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next week. And please remember to love everybody. Good night.